Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ipek Burnett, representing the International Association for Jungian Studies, and it's wonderful to be with all of you here today and to welcome Dr. Safron Rossi for what I know will be a very interesting and inspiring talk. Today, Dr. Rossi will take us into the living relationship between astrology and alchemy, two ancient ways of understanding the soul and cosmos. She describes astrology as offering a heavenly view of the psyche, while alchemy gives us the earthly one, an art of transformation rooted in the natural world. Together, they form what she calls a micro-cosmology of the soul. Dr. Rossi quotes Jung saying alchemy is inconceivable without the influence of her elder sister, astrology. And her work helps us see what that really means. It's an invitation to really connect psyche with nature and cosmos. Drawing from James Hillman's writings on the elements, fire, earth, air, water, she'll guide us towards a deeper understanding of these forces, not just as metaphors, but as living presences in our lives, inner and outer lives. I will quickly share her bio here. Safron Rossi, PhD, has spent her life steeped in mythology, literature, and art. She's a professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies MA PhD program, as well as an archetypal psychological astrologer. Her writing and scholarly studies focus on Greek mythology, archetypal psychology, astrology, and goddess traditions. For many years, she was the curator of the Joseph Campbell, James Hillman, and Maria Gimbuta's manuscript collections at Opus Archives. Dr. Rossi is author of The Correct Goddess, A Mythology and Psychology, published in 2021, co-editor of Jung on Astrology, published in 2017, and editor of Joseph Campbell's Goddesses, Mysteries of the Feminine Divine, which was published in 2013. Safron has published articles in Jungian, archetypal, and astrological journals, and has given lectures across the US and internationally in Europe, South America, and Australia. Dr. Rossi is author of The Correct Goddess, A Mythology and Psycho. Oh, sorry, I already did that. I had the great honor and pleasure of knowing Safran for nearly 20 years, starting in when she was at the Opus Archives and I was a graduate student with a special grant for the James Hillman collection. And I so fondly remember poring over those typewritten notes and letters with her. It was also there in Opus Archives. Talking with Dr. Rossi is when I first learned about archetypal psychological astrology from her. So I've been very eagerly waiting for this presentation today. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Safron Rossi.
Thank you so much for that really beautiful introduction, Ipek. And I also want to thank the seminar committee of the IAJS for inviting me to give this presentation today. Hi, everyone. I noticed when people were being let into the room that there's some former students, which is awesome. Hello. And then, of course, colleagues in the field. So I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas with you today. So just going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen. And let me just move a couple of things around. Sorry, hang on just a second so I can see. Okay. So I want to begin, as this first slide shows, by giving you a roadmap for what I'm doing in this presentation, because they're somewhat complex ideas. And so my work today is to discuss the relationship between astrology and alchemy from an archetypal psychological perspective. In other words, as Ipek had shared in the intro, alchemy and astrology are joined by the psyche. And in order to explore that, I want to do that by focusing on the 4 elements, which I have written down below in this diagram. And the ideas that I'm relying on most here are, first of all, Jung's, whose in-depth and thorough study of the psyche and alchemy revealed the way that these pseudoscientific laboratory processes were deeply symbolic processes of an archetypal nature. But when we turn to the elements, it's to the writings of James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, who's going to come to the foreground in the way that I'm treating these ideas, because he illuminates the more cosmological and imaginal aspects of alchemy. And through this presentation, I'm going to be showing you alchemical images from various texts, but I'm not going to go into those texts because what's important for my talk here is the symbolism, the images. And I'm going to define alchemy shortly, but first I want to make some broader reflections on the key ideas that undergird, that form the groundwork of archetypal astrology. So astrology is the study and interpretation of human experience in relation to the movement of the heavens, the positions and the interrelationships and the cycles of the planets. And the basic principle at work in archetypal astrology, as articulated by Richard Tarnas, which I imagine some of you have heard of, an astrologer, historian of philosophy, and also depth psychological oriented thinker. He writes, "The planets have a fundamental cosmically based connection to specific archetypal forces or principles which influence human existence, and that the patterns formed by the planets in the heavens bear a meaningful correspondence to the patterns of human affairs on Earth." Now, this view that Tarnas is pointing out is founded in Jung's theory of synchronicity, which bridges the realm of the inner world with the outer world. And the outer movement of the heavens and our lives are, in essence, connected through the phenomenon of synchronicity. Now, we know what a synchronicity is, right? It's when 2 events that are not causally connected, and yet they appear to form a meaningful pattern, right? So this inner experience and outer event are experienced themselves as connected solely through meaning rather than any cause and effect link, hence an acausal connection. And I imagine that all of us have had this happen, where we meet throughout the day a series of events or conversations that spontaneously occur, that have a theme repeated over and again, as if something of like the world was speaking directly to us. And it's as if, I think what happens is that those events create a sense that there's a kind of invisible orchestration at work. And those experiences are often very, very meaningful. And this is important, the feeling of being seen in a meaningful way by the world, by the universe, by the objective psyche, however we might sort of phrase that. So this is, and synchronicities are, of course, both mysterious and also profoundly powerful, and can be very healing experiences, because there's a sense that there's a caring and deep intelligence at work in life, right? So synchronicity is Jung's idea of this coincidence between an inner state and the outer world. Now, as Tarnas just expresses so crisply, he writes, Jung saw nature and one's surrounding environment as a living matrix of potential synchronistic meanings that could illuminate the human sphere, all events, inner and outer, recognized as sources of potential psychological and spiritual significance. Now, astrologically speaking, our birth charts are an example of this, that the location of the planets at the time of our birth do not cause us to have the characteristics that we have. Rather, there is a meaningful coincidence of the planetary alignments with our character and our deeper nature. And in that perspective, then transits, meaning the relationships formed between where planets are at any given moment in relationship to our natal chart, can reflect this meaningful coincidence in terms of life experiences. Again, both profoundly psychological, but then of course reflected in our outer life as well. So there is a synchronous correspondence between the planets and human life that is intelligible. Now, what Jung saw was that what underlies synchronicities, this inner and outer connection, is the archetypal factor. So the idea is that life itself, the world, nature, the things that happen in life, all of these are shaped and animated by the symbolically patterned archetypal powers of life, right? Archetypes are formative principles or patterns that shape behaviors, ideas, and symbols, and that have a universal quality that have appeared throughout human history. I mean, just take, for example, the archetypal figure of the trickster. We find that figure in the Yoruban tradition of the god Eshu, in the Native American figure of the coyote, in the Greek imagination that was Hermes, right? We see these figures across the world in time. So in this sense, celestial movements and human experiences can be seen as intertwined, informed by the same archetypal processes that pervade the cosmos. Think about the archetypal process of giving birth. The new moon symbolizes that same experience. Death as an archetypal experience correlates to the waning moon. Form building processes can be related to the astrological principle of Saturn. Processes of connection belong to Mercury, the Greek Hermes. You see, so we can, look at all of these astrological factors from an archetypal perspective. And so, drawing from this theoretical ground, astrology is a symbolic art depicting the archetypal patterns and energies of the psyche. And the key idea to hold on to is that astrology is not concretely predictive, but archetypally predictive. Yeah. And this understanding is what underlies our ability to look at astrology not based on a causal model, but rather one of archetypal correlation. And if life, both inner and outer, is structured by these universal patterns, then the planets indicate the archetypal dynamics at work at any particular moment in time. So it's a paradigm and an art that has to do with the meaningful correspondence or synchronicity between above and below. And in the words of the ancient philosopher Plotinus, all things breathe together. So to say it simply, archetypes are living forces within us, and astrology maps those forces symbolically. And it does this via the planets, of course, as well as by the zodiac signs, and then the houses and the elements and the geometrical alignments between planets. All factors in astrology can be looked at in a deeply symbolic way. So that was my just sort of laying some groundwork for those of you that perhaps don't know or haven't heard a particularly psychological and archetypal approach to astrology, but just to kind of get us on the same page. Okay, so now I want to dive into the ideas, the relationship of alchemy to astrology. In alchemy, astrology is imagined to be reflected in nature. The alchemists believed that as the planets revolved around the earth, their metals are spun into it. Isn't that a beautiful idea? Each planet was associated with a particular metal, as above, so below. So the planets in heaven correspond to the metals in the earth. And in this image, there's a mountain upon which stand the gods, and you can see them, the gods of the astrological pantheon. At the very top is Hermes, Mercury. On the lower right is Saturn. You can always identify Saturn because he's holding the scythe. And so the gods of the astrological pantheon stand on this mountain, and it's as if they're arising from the depths of the earth. Notice that around the mountain is the zodiac. It encircles the sky, right? You can see the zodiacal figures, and then we have these four circles in each corner within which the elements reside. Ignis is fire, Eris is air, Terra is earth, Aquae is water, right? And the various stages of the alchemical process of transformation are written on the steps that are leading into the heart of the mountain. So you can see at the bottom step, it says calcination, and then each one continues on. And then the way to those steps, one must be blindfolded so that we do not proceed by rational or intellectual perception. That's what this little guy in the foreground on the right is showing us. He can't see with his sort of sensate eyes, so to speak, his intellectual eyes. We need to move toward the mountain in that same kind of mode. Rather, like the fellow on the left, we have to proceed by following one's instincts. Look, he's chasing a rabbit that's entering into the earth. The instincts, the animal soul nature that draws on feeling, intuition, and imagination as much as observation and theory. I mean, this picture is really a cosmological vision that sees the world, inner and outer, as ensouled with a greater order of divine forces that are organizing the world. And this vision operates at both a macro and microcosmic level, with the macro very clearly at work in astrology. And Hillman understood this, and he wrote, "Astrology returns events to the gods." And as a form of imagining, Hillman continued and said, "Astrology provides images to be pondered for their symbolic richness and mythic amplification. They afford archetypal data, divine gifts." Yeah, this is from a talk he gave back in '97. So, where astrology provides us a heavenly view of the imaginal cosmos of the soul, alchemy provides us with a microcosmos. So like astrology, it connects us to the gods, but in a very earth-focused, substantive way. And as Ipek had already so beautifully shared, I mean, this is really about taking to heart Jung's statement, so it's worth repeating again. Jung wrote, "Alchemy is inconceivable without the influence of her elder sister astrology." And so to explore this, pulling out some of these threads on Hillman's alchemical writings in order for us to work more deeply, soulfully with the elemental qualities of astrology. And so I'm utilizing some of these reflections of Hillman's today in order to offer some new and old ideas and ways of languaging and psychologically sparking these sister arts. Okay, so As I've already sort of touched on, archetypal astrology has a cosmological vision, and cosmological myths concern the creation of the world, but they are about the psyche, the nature of its primary forces, and how those forces, mythopoetically speaking, the gods, came into being. And these origin myths serve to provide an image of the universe as a soul space and fill it with a sense of the divinity that underlies, animates, and orders it. And as Joseph Campbell observed, cosmological myths are also concerned with bringing us into accord with those divine forces. And in this way, Hillman describes that the gods of the astrological sky, he says, quote, makes possible a grand new idea of order, a cosmological imagination whose thought speaks for the cosmos in the aesthetic forms of images. Now, what we know about cosmologies is that they almost always begin with chaos, right? That's how the sort of universe comes into being. There's a kind of chaotic eruption of something. Here in this particular depiction, this is the sort of a zodiacal way of imagining the chaos of the cosmos forming. And if you look in this image, there are pairs, the polarity pairs of the zodiacal signs are in sort of standoffs with one another. And just to direct your eye most immediately, in the middle foreground, you see these two figures embracing. That's the twins, Castor and Pollux, or Helen and Clytemnestra, whatever mythic twins you might think of, Gemini twins. And they're being practically poked at by the centaur of Sagittarius. Gemini and Sag are an oppositional polarity. And you can see that over and again. Further in the middle toward the left, you see the lion, Leo, sort of swallowing the water of the Aquarius water bearer, pouring it into its mouth. But then, of course, there's all of this strange, intense smoke and fire that's emerging around these figures. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod said, "Verily at the first chaos came to be, but next wide-bosomed earth, the ever-sure foundation of all." Chaos is the void from which the universe is born. And originally in Greek, chaos means it yawns. It yawns. So chaos is an image of a kind of vast, open mouth of the cosmos. And only later, in the Western imagination, the four elements come into existence. When that happens, chaos comes to mean turmoil and confusion, because then there's multiplicity, right? Well, the moment we turn toward multiplicity, it's like we're turning toward alchemy, because I think chaos is what we encounter when we're studying alchemy. There's no fixed standard definition of anything, no definite order of processes, and each alchemist describes things in frustratingly idiosyncratic ways. So that being, what it is, I will attempt to simplify some of these things, my own way of thinking about it, and in that sense, I think I would say that alchemy is, to define it, a sacred work in search of the supreme value. And the supreme value has been variously symbolized as alchemical gold, or the philosopher's stone, or the elixir of life. Now, alchemy has always had two faces. There's the transformation of matter in the laboratory that deals on the one hand with concrete material chemical processes. But on the other hand, it was also about psychological processes of transformation, which were projected both consciously and partly unconsciously upon the materials in the lab. And the work begins with finding the prima materia, which is sometimes called the massa confusa, like the big confusion, and then subjecting it to a series of alchemical operations that will eventually turn it into the philosopher's stone, which is the great incorruptible treasure or miraculous substance. Now, prima materia means first matter. In other words, primary stuff. Metaphorically, it's we who are the prima materia. And psychological development, the deepening or the evolution of consciousness is the alchemical work. Now, in the words of the Jungian analyst Edward Edinger, he wrote, "The urge to consciousness exists with nature, with the unconscious psyche, and an ego is needed to realize fully that natural urge. It is required that the individual cooperate deliberately in the task of creating consciousness." So, in Jungian and archetypal psychology, alchemy depicts the transformation of consciousness and has to do with the nature of psychic life. So the quest for the elixir or gold is really a search for inner treasure. And, I would say that that's what Hillman calls soul making, or what Jung's terms would be individuation and, the movement and development of a deeper relationship with the self. So, okay, so another piece here. For the archaic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, the nature of the world is flux. Ever changing, the cosmos is continually creating new combinations of ancient forms. Therefore, we must begin with rudiments, first principles, in order to make order, right? To begin to make some order. And to get there, we turn back along the path of epistrophe, the turning or looking back to the mythopoetic or imaginal background that provides order to the massa confusa of psychic phenomena. So, this links us again back to both Hillman and Jung. And as Hillman drew directly from Jung saying, stick to the image, to the colors, to the chemicals, the vessels, the fire, images of the sensate imagination as it presents states of soul, right? Sticking to the image for Hillman would be sticking to the sensate imagination as it presents states of soul. And the four elements are the primary stuff of the cosmos. So to stay close to how they display themselves can help us from getting entirely overwhelmed or lost. And this is part of the practice of turning chaos into order. Now, language is a main avenue of epistrophe, and because alchemical language uses thing words, Hillman says, image words, craft words, we can drop into a sensational landscape whose descriptions we can feel, taste, see, and recall quite intimately in bodily senses on a feeling level. And describing the states and qualities of the soul in a mode of elemental imagining, a kind of as if stance that applies to both alchemy and astrology. And the last sort of pieces to put here, and then we'll go right into the first element. I think of elements as spheres of awareness. It's like the way Hillman defined the gods as styles of consciousness, modes of perception, right? And elemental spheres of awareness are given with everything in astrology. Everything has an elemental dimension to it. And even further, elemental images and qualities connect us in a very specific and concrete way to psychological experience. So in alchemy, the four elements are the various processes that the prima materia is subjected to in a multitude of ways. And in astrology, these same four elements are the energetic character, or the essence of the zodiac signs. And since the planets, the gods of the archetypal imagination, are always traversing through some sign, they're always expressing something of their values, their need, or their style through a sign's particular elemental character. So zodiac signs, far from being like stereotypical ways of typing, really reveal physical and psychological substances. So image rich and focused on change, alchemy provides a deeply sensate language that reveals states of soul. And soul making needs an adequate vocabulary that holds both the imagination and the embodied emotional experience. And together, alchemical language and astrological images can do this. So here is my contribution to the elemental intelligence of astrology with alchemical psychological language. So we're going to start with the element of earth. The question of the gods in the microcosm of the soul brings us to earth. And I opened this talk with the idea that the alchemists believed that as the planets revolve, so their metals form and grow in the earth. So the metals were imagined to be the seeds of the planets in the earth. The sun is seeded in gold, the moon, Luna, in silver, Mercury in quicksilver, copper carries Venus's seed, iron is Mars, Jupiter is seated in tin, and Saturn in lead. So the gods are the vivifying powers within the matters of earth, or in alchemical terms, earth is our nurse, right? So here, this image of the earth as nurse shows us that this elemental field has to do with nurturance and support. Earth gives sustenance to what is newly born, as Taurus, the first earth sign, follows Aries, the spark of new life. Earth, its metals, are the elemental metaphor for the stuff of our lives, dealing with matter and with what matters. As Hillman says, things on earth, especially the metals in the earth, are in touch with the gods. They bear mythical messages. Earth signs have to do with how we deal with matter and the physical universe. Taurus and what we possess. Virgo, how we change and manifest. Capricorn, processes of building and becoming masterful. The Taurian second house of what one owns, one's possessions, as well as one's talents. These belong to Aphrodite, Venus, in her earthly prowess. This Taurus is Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite in her sensual earthly face. The Virgoan sixth house of our day-to-day life has to do with all the rituals and responsibilities that belong to our movements on a very mundane level. And that there are spirits in the metals that instruct us, help us understand the kinds of work we are to undertake. For example, lead, which is Saturn's metal, instructs slowness, and matter connects us to the limits and constraints of reality, as well as the skills and responsibilities of its navigation, what we ascribe to the domain of Saturn. So coagulatio, which is the Latin alchemical term for transformation by earth, belongs experiences of restriction and responsibility, acceptance of material limits, but as well as achievement. So too, experiences of stuckness and stagnation. Earth is the most stable element because it's wedded to matter. And so Earth, on some level, resists change. So as coagulations of the moist vapors, metals were diagnosed by alchemists as phlegmatic in nature, meaning that they were passive or inert and therefore required fire fire is the primary element of change. So we see fire always in alchemical images. And as Hillman says on this, resistance to change is given with the seed of our nature, and only intense heat can move human nature from its innate inertia. So only alchemical fire, psychic heat, has the properties that can work on the metal spirits, transforming their innate qualities so that they're purified and joined together and integrated into the stone. So the fire of Psyche's heat, the eye of the soul, works upon the earth and is worked in return by the earth. So another way to maybe, look at this is that coagulatio, earth movements, has to do with coming to know what matters, the development of a sense of the purposefulness of the various areas of one's life. Again, as Hillman, shines a light on this, that the planetary spirits are in the earth as metals reminds us that the gods are within the world, buried in the depths of earthly affairs, under our feet. And as we are of the earth, so too are we comprised of the various metals that are seated by the gods. And there's no better symbol of that particular elemental mixing of the gods than the astrological birth chart, because it captures the archetypal quality of the moment of one's seated character, we might say. So the chart illustrating the moment of birth, which is of course archetypal, is an image of order, of a kind of manifest order, and it invites a building of our micro-cosmology. So earth is matter, it's the stuff of our lives, it's the metals mined from the earth that the gods display their values and desires. The physical properties mirror the gods' characters, and their weights, their color, and textures are substantive. So the gods' ore bodies are vital seeds, embodiments of soul, which live through us, giving us our attitudes or styles of character, the issues of our lives, the sufferings, our complexes, and also the gifts and graces. So this image of the gods being the power that resides in the things of the earth, in us, in our matter, both physical and psychic, is key in terms of Hillman's alchemical thought. And this is something I really want to underscore, that if we truly understand and take in this idea that the archetypal nature of life is symbolized by the gods as planets of our birth charts, then what we are in service to is that bit of nature flowing through us. This shifts the interest and concern to the soul rather than to me and myself, right? It is our psyche that takes its form from the gods, from the archetypal powers or deep nature, as we might call it. And so our work may not be about making ourselves, myself, more whole or complete, but rather to learn to attend to that bit of nature that's flowing through us, as symbolized by our birth chart. And, in Hillman's own words, he wrote, "Our lives are on loan to the psyche for a while. During this time, we are its caretakers who try to do for it what we can." And we can also hear this in the poet Auden, who wrote, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand." Okay, so fire. Fire is the root metaphor and the first principle for Heraclitus. For Hillman too, who wrote, "Its radiance, its flickering instability, its warmth, and its rage is primary." So throwing light beams into the alchemical chaos, fire's light helps us discern landscapes. Hillman says that it's the element below and above the range of human reason, which means fire also connects us to the gods. Now, fire is the first element in astrology, the spring equinox in the tropical zodiac is the 0 degrees Aries point. So it's about beginnings. It symbolizes beginnings. We could say that Aries is the ascendant of astrology. And in a birth chart, the ascendant marks the moment of our first breath in the world outside our mother. So our first breath, that coming forth of life on its own impetus and energy, this is what Aries gives an image for, the rushing ram that springs forth and its impulse of life toward being. Now, of the 4 elements, fire is the least reflective. Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius are impelled to move, to vision, and to rise like flickering flames. Fire's nature is to burn, to consume fuel, and therefore grow. It is active, hence symbolically masculine in the sense that it penetrates space with its heat. So transformation by fire is the alchemical process of calcinatio, calcination, the heating of a substance to high temperatures. In his book, The Raw and the Cooked, the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss discusses how many world cultures regard cooking as the symbolic activity that, quote, establishes the difference between animals and people, right? So cooking is transformative. It moves us from surviving to savoring to civilizing, and it affects change in all manner of things. Now, again, in alchemy, we are what is being cooked. We are the vessel and the stuff that's in the vessel, as well as the lab in which it's all happening, right? This is the depth psychological view. We are the primal chaos that the fire is illuminating and heating. So alchemical fire can be imagined as the heat of the soul cooking, consuming, and transforming itself. And alchemical fire is an invisible heat. As Hillman says, it's a psychic heat that clamors for fuel. See, alchemical fire, this is different from the heat of nature, which is slow and moves on its own accord. Alchemical fire hastens nature. And again, Hillman helps. He writes, the art of fire means learning how to warm, excite, enthuse, ignite, inspire the state of one's nature so to activate it further into a different state, right? So in the cosmology of soul, fire is what activates change. Fire is connected to those emotions that are active, dynamic, that compel us and impel us. So this is emotional fire as change agents. Think about anger, blistering bliss, desire, fury, enthusiasm. So as a process of change, calcinatio is also a kind of purging or purifying. Fire drives out what is unconscious, bringing it to the foreground so that light, fire, consciousness can be made with it and thereby be changed. There's this extraordinary poem that I want to read you by Dorsha Hayes, and it's titled Fire Hazard. And I mean, she describes the calcinatio process in the most extraordinary way. So listen to this. Filled with the clutter of unsorted stuff, a spark can set a man ablaze. What's there heaped high among stored rubbish at a puff will burst into flame. No man can be aware of how inflammable he is, how prone to what can rage beyond control, unless the piled up litter of his life is known to him and he is able to assess what hazard he is in, what could ignite. A man disordered and undisciplined lives in the peril of a panicked flight before the onrush of a flaming wind. Does it now seem I seek to be profound? I stand on smoking ash and blackened ground. Yeah, so, I'm sure we all have our smoldering ash places that we are familiar with. Um, so alchemists were artists of fire, and our primary work, the alchemist's primary work, is learning all there is to know about fire, its various kinds, its sources, its fuels, because not all fire is fed in the same way. And this image really captures that in a gorgeous way. Look at all of the different kinds of fuel the woman has in her kitchen. Cut planks of wood, a pile of coal, twigs and branches, right? All different kinds of fuel for the fire. Astrologically, each sign is a different kind of fire and ruled by a different planetary archetype that burns in a special way, all of which is unique to each chart and its configurations. So there are fiery particularities to Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. Mars has its own style of fire, the iron of angry fire, right? So all gods, all planets have their kinds of fire. Fire, again, is a metaphor for psychic heat, what turns us on, what burns us into our life, what burns us out. It is helpful to work with fire signs, Mars and the sun in particular, as indicators for where psychic heat burns, places where the imagination is lit, where will and desires are both caught up and contained. Fire rises, it's activating change in form, state, and quality. What do we say when we're, trying to get things going? Let's turn the heat up on this, right? Fire transforms matter through heat, and its various kinds of heat. As in alchemy, the images are exquisite in their particularity. There's a kind of heat that's described as focused brooding, which is like the hen sitting on her eggs, or there's the heat like that of the summer sun. How do we generate the heat of internality? What Hillman described as the ardor of inner heat, right? So the sun, solar fire, who I am, that's the sun as the individual heart essence. It's a determined and kind of willful fire arced toward its becoming. Now, in the alchemical cosmos, I also want to point out that there are two sources of fire. There's earthly fire and ethereal fire. So earthly fire, terrestrial fire, comes out of the earth. So think thermal springs, gases, geysers, volcanoes. Mars and Pluto have their own kinds of terrestrial fires that can suddenly erupt. And Hillman says that these are to be understood as, quote, interior culinary fires, metabolic heats of the body, right? So psychologically, we might think of the frustration of pleasures and power drives, bitterness and rage as terrestrial fire. Whereas celestial fire descends from stars and lightning, this sort of Jupiterian territory. And it comes, Hillman says, in flashes and fevers, explosive manias, and star-struck blindings. So having a vision, having a revelation, that's an ethereal kind of fire. Think about Sagittarius, which is symbolized by the centaur, who is half horse, half man, and combines both vision with instinct, and it's ruled by a red-hot Jupiter. The Sagittarian archer, his bow and arrow is always cocked toward the heavens, compelled to shoot from the ground and pierce the web of universal truth. So, last piece. Hillman advises that we have to learn to fight fire with fire. That means that we have to meet fire with the fiery material of our own passions, our own inspirations. Fire is the spark and thrust of our desires, our longings, and our visions. And to come to terms with our fire, we have to imagine into our fire, right? Our drives, our passions have astrological images, and that's one way we can work with our fire. A Mars in Aries, impulsive, leaping forth, impelled by the rushing breath of life and ambition. A blue fire, Mars in Aquarius, weighted by Saturn's Senex matters, and perhaps Uranian breakthroughs. Mars in Cancer, where emotions flare hot and stream past, but must be made use of, for whom desire is a kind of clarion bell for direction. And, I want to point out too that in alchemy, Mars's metal is iron, and iron is forged in baths of fire. Right? So Mars, fire, and imagining into our fires is very often the task there. Okay. Ooh, that got kind of hot and intense. So now we're going to move to water. I'm going to bring it down for a moment. Heraclitus wrote, "Moisture makes the soul succumb to joy." Is that a beautiful line? Moisture makes the soul succumb to joy. The soul loves moisture and its proclivities of emotion, reverie, and reflection, all imagined in watery ways. So this style of reflection can be related astrologically to the moon. As the moon reflects the light of the sun, so reflective consciousness is a mediating awareness that takes place between events and their meaning. And reflection is, of course, a primary mode of Hillman's soul making. So this provides another turn into the insight, perhaps around the fourth house in an astrological chart, wherein we reflect on the activities of the first three houses of being, having, and perceiving. And I realize that I'm sort of diving into some astrological particularities, but I know that some of you are already sort of in that world. And for the rest of you, just sort of, I don't know, flow with me here. Luna is the goddess of the waters, and she rules the fourth house of a chart. And the fourth house is related to self-reflection, endings, the personal dimension of the unconscious, the archetype of home, both in the historical, physical sense, our experiences of home, but also the longing and the search for feeling at home. And lastly, it's also related to the mother, both, again, personal, human, behind whom stands the archetypal great mother. So the psychological symbolism is rich, and along with showing one style of reflection, our moon and all of the particularities of it, the sign it's in, the house it's in, its aspects, also says something about the quality of our self-image, how we feel about ourselves. Yeah, this is all watery territory. So one alchemical rule that we read is, perform no operation until all has become water. And I think this means that not until emotion permeates should we act. And Hillman amplifies on this point. Rational analysis must wait for emotion to flow, reveries to float, collect in pools, stir, sink, find outlets. So to sort of amplify this, when the matter, meaning the issue or the complex, the bit of hardness that we're encountering in our life, begins to find movement and begins to melt into something fluid, that means something is happening. When we begin to be able to imagine into the problem that we're dealing with and not just be caught in trying to sort it out, that's the melting into fluidity, water and reverie, right? What has become fixed, habitual, literal, can start to dissolve and take a softer shape. This is the work of solutio, which is transformation by water. In other words, a connection to the unconscious within which are the source waters of life. Now, astrologically speaking, the water houses are the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses, right? And they're described as, or called soul houses. They have to do with deep emotional yearnings, which are often partly unconscious. The psychological astrologer Stephen Arroyo wrote that the cycle of the water houses shows the process of gaining awareness through assimilating the essence of the past and letting go of the residue which has outlived its usefulness. So we could think of that as submerging and integrating and then burning off through psychic heat what is no longer useful. He goes on to say, when these parts of ourselves are made conscious, they can come alive with great force. The fact that Waterhouse planets often reveal factors in our lives that transcend, overwhelm, or undermine our conscious orientation is to be welcomed, for the ego consciousness often becomes stuck in limited patterns of expression and therefore needs periodic confrontation with the deeper sources of life within us. So, in other words, planets located in these water houses must be consciously attended to rather than unconsciously emotionally charged. And this image that I have here of the king drowning, I mean, this really points to water ordeals, that those experiences of intense emotional levels, which the water houses can really symbolize. So the ordeal by water can be experienced as floodings of emotion, like emotional inundation, um, emotions and feelings of loss and grief, and even helplessness. Now, paradoxically, alchemical fire is employed to dry the soul when it gets soggy. That's how I would put it. And this is because, turning back to Heraclitus, dry, the soul grows wise and good, right? So we could say that some moistening is beneficial for the soul. It results in its delight, but like all things, too much water and what grows is mold, right? Too much water is a way to perhaps describe moodiness and the descents into depression when one is inundated by the waters of the unconscious. And yet, cut off from water, being too dry, can suggest an emotional deadness or dryness where one doesn't feel anything. So, cut off from the source of life, there's no flow of emotion, imagination, or reverie. Everything becomes concrete and is seen for its face value. So one way to imagine into this that alchemists had was the bain marie, which means Mary's bath. And it was one of the tools of the alchemical process that allows for water and fire to be applied to the substance undergoing the work. Essentially, those of you that cook, this is a double boiler. And the bain marie aids in the heating of the substance without it being burnt too quickly by too intense a heat. So the heat is gradually raised and is being tempered by the water, and so that whatever is being held in the vessel can begin to relax without being too quickly burned. So we could say that the bain marie allows for the creation of the right kind of languid heat that keeps the temperature up and melts the resistance to change. So a conductor of alchemical fire, watery is the elemental medium of the soul. It's the dream element, moist and moving, animated and flowing. As Hillman says, dreaming is a nightly dip, a skinny dip into the pools of images and feelings. Dreams solve problems because all dreams are wet. They dissolve the mental constraints of the day world in the flow of imagination. So tension knots hard edges, our stony complexes, the sureties in our life that are impoverished of imagination, water finds purchase in the tiniest fissures and helps to make things begin to flow, right? The soul stirs things back to life by moistening. Okay, last final element, air. Air is the element related to the process of sublimatio. Chemically, when a solid is heated, it passes into a gaseous state and ascends to the top of the vessel. Sublimatio is that process of volatilizing and elevating the material. In Latin, sublimis means high, so we're dealing here with rising, ascending movements. So this is the intellect and contemplation and objective reflection and imagining, an airy kind of imagining, are related to the airy planes of height and cool distance. These areas of the mind and perception rise above immediate experience in order to comprehend what's happening. So transformation by air, sublimatio, would be related to the ways in which we try to get above an issue, so to see it objectively, the mind and its desire for wider vision. And, you know, one of the ways that I would sort of amplify this is through Saturn, and that's who's actually depicted in this alchemical image. Saturn is in the air, holding his scythe, and as if regurgitating the stone that he was given in place of baby Zeus, right? So Saturn is the god who personifies the archetypal principles of limitation, restriction, boundaries, death. Saturn is the wise old one around whom constellates slowness, maturity, and wisdom through experience and concrete manifestation. He's also the style of consciousness that's related to objectivity, the distance that allows for meaning and order to come into view. I mean, in the ancient world, before the discovery of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, Saturn was the farthest known, farthest visible planet in the ancient tradition. And so he was imagined as the one that could see from the farthest reaches, beholding the cosmic order from the most imaginable distance. So with Saturn can come a farther, wider vision. And I think this is related to how meaning functions, in that it is the capacity to see all the individual sparks and events as belonging to an order that transcends the singular event, and in fact helps us discern something of the larger pattern. We could see this as Jupiterian, but there's a lot here that has to do with Saturn in the sense of what we create in our lives through Saturn's pressures and tasks, becoming essential and enduring gifts. Those qualities of our character and those experiences that become the treasures hard won, the rocks upon which we build our life, the rocks with which we soul make. And I think it's useful to recall the role of meaning in this regard in terms of Jung's therapy of the soul. Individuation might be thought of as the meaningful rendering of a life narrative. And that is what allows one to begin to feel some kind of mastery in life, yeah? And Saturn is the masterful, wise king who knows the nature of the world, how to be in it, of it, and therefore rule it well. And I think this understanding about the reality of the world as being the place where we live into the depths of the psyche is what soul making and alchemy is about. And so this image of Saturn in the sky, in the air, I think is really one way to imagine into the alchemical process of sublimatio and how we might think of that psychologically in terms of the meaningful rendering of a life narrative, the story that kind of holds it together. I'm aware of time, and so while I have many other things that I would like to share with you, I'm going to sort of move more quickly at this point. One more thing to perhaps, one more thing to perhaps offer, alchemically, air, we can think of the air state as meaning getting above an issue to see it from some distance, right? So to just expand that for a moment, and turning toward Edward Edinger and this really fabulous point he makes, finding suitable words or concepts for a psychic state may be sufficient for a person to get out of it enough to look down on it from above. In other words, finding suitable words and concepts to help us begin to move a little bit outside of the eye of the storm of a constellated complex, right? And how that in and of itself is a kind of sublimatio move, like, oh, I have language or an image that I can begin to relate to see what's going on. This is a sublimatio process. Now, to kind of conclude this and to draw this into the art and practice of astrology, when people come to me for a reading, I really see what they're coming for is a sublimatio experience. They're looking for some perspective, for some distance and insight into their situation. And the astrological moves them from being immersed subjectively in their situation and allows for some space where ideas, words, and images can come in. The result, hopefully, being, of course, some recognition, a more imaginal comprehension and understanding of their situation. See, this is sublimatio, a deep archetypal elemental process of air. This image from Splendor Solis, you know, the astrologer, I imagine myself as the dude kneeling on the ground, trying to apply more heat to whatever it is that's going on for the person who's shown up at my door. They're in their own psychic bath, they're cooking, stuff is happening in their life. How do I provide images and help them connect to both the cosmological and the alchemic nature images of the psyche to help them in their own process, right? To help them in their own cooking. So notice how there's a dove sitting on the guy's head in the bath. Something's trying to be recognized. Notice the rising of perspective that this scene shows us. The archways, the bridge, the people on the bridge, the sky above. This is sublimatio, that sense of, oh, there's perspective and distance and different floors on which I can move up and down in order to get some sense of things. So for those of us who are astrologers, if our astrological vision is an alchemical one, where transformation of consciousness is the reason for the work, then perhaps, you know, you too can imagine yourself as the guy working the bellows, keeping the fire going so that the person in the bath begins to see something of value in the experience that has brought them to us. And maybe if you're not an astrologer, but you love astrology and it's part of your own psycho-spiritual practice, you can recognize that that's partly what you're doing in the sitting with the astrological images. You know, so for Hillman, alchemy is a symbolic language which gives us some of the most rich description of states of soul. The archetypal ground of life is expressed in exquisite particularity in both alchemical and astrological images. And when read and understood metaphorically, rather than as stereotypes and literal processes or personality descriptions, we are given a way to imagine more deeply in our lives. So to end in this alchemical micro-cosmology Earth is gravid with the gods. The waters of life rise and fall. Rainy seasons give way to the heat of the sun. The fire works upon everything as the psychic heat and ardor of being, and the breath of life, the imagination, encircles the cosmos. Alchemy and astrology together provide cosmological visions of the soul, as above, so below. Thank you. And sorry, that was a lot to sort of give you all now, but yeah, so it is. Thank you.
Safron, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful, inspiring, soulful, but truly brilliant presentation you have given us. You have gifted us
Thank you.
such insight, imagery, poetry. I'm going to be sitting with this for days and weeks and months to come. I am very mindful of time. I know we have about 15 minutes before we wrap up, which is not much given that this is such a rich conversation. But if there's anyone in the audience that want to come forth with their questions, reflections, what's resonated with you, what you're wondering about, as long as it's a quick one, I'm going to call on, I see Peter here. I'm going to start with him. And then if you don't get a chance to share your questions, reflections, please do feel free to email me, and I'd be more than happy to forward them to Dr. Rossi later on. Okay, Peter, see you.
Thank you, Safron. And there's just too many things to say, so I'm wondering if you could read that poem again, back a ways, right before the fire section.
Oh, the one by Dorsha Hayes?
I want to get that name down.
Oh yeah, why don't I, you know what? I can put that into the chat and then you can copy it. How about that?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
That was a fun and exciting talk.
Thank you so much, Peter. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, so here's.
Thank you, Peter. And there is Richard.
There we go. Yes. Hi.
Hi again. It's good to see you. Thank you so much. Wonderful, rich presentation.
Thank you.
Inspiring. So I won't go into any deep astrological stuff. I had a wondering about the dignities and how they relate to the elements, but I can do that work on my own. That last picture also speaks to me from Splendor Solis. It also speaks to me not only of the astrologer, but also the analyst
Yes.
with the patient in the bath, you know, the analyst and stirring that, and everything must be reduced to water first. That's a wonderful image.
Yes. Yeah, isn't that an extraordinary image? And you know, in the border, it has this very gorgeously illuminated border. It's all birds. And birds, of course, are related to sublimatio. Like it's sort of in the flora and fauna expression of that realm of the alchemical universe, the alchemical world. Birds are air animals, of course, right? And yeah, I mean, I think, and your point about that image as speaking equally to analysis, analytical work, that yeah, I think that's quite present. And you know, as an archetypal psychological astrologer, it's always front and center that what I'm engaging with in terms of a chart is really the psyche, and so that really holding that is very, very important. And so I think that's where there's the wedding between the depth psychological tradition practice, and then what is it that we're doing when we're holding space with people in an astrological session.
Thanks again for being here. And
yeah, well, thank you for coming.
Anyone else? Any reflections? Any questions? If not, I do have a question, but I hesitate to share it because it's kind of big and we don't have too much time, but I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
So you talk about how we see these elemental archetypes at work in our psychological life, but also in collective experiences, right, of change and transformation. And I was really struck with the way you were talking about chaos, it yawns, you said, right, in ancient Greek, and expansion, turmoil, confusion. And I so deeply resonate with that, joining this call from the United States. And as we all know, we are going through quite a bit, and there's a lot of tension and confusion and dread and potential transformation. So how can we bring these insights you shared with us, not in terms of technique or prediction, but for reflection into our collective chaos?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm always thinking astrologically when I'm, listening to the news and watching these larger movements that are happening in the collective, because all things can have a birth chart, and the United States is one of them. And so there is a birth chart for the United States, and it's fascinating. And it's fascinating what transits the United States itself is undergoing, and how we can imagine that as being an image for all of us that are somehow connected to the US, the larger collective unconscious and the collective character. But that is a whole nother thing, and I'm not going to go there. I think that, you know, to think of this from perhaps Hillman's perspective is, how do we, I'm thinking specifically of the way he says that not until all things become water should we act. And I think there's something there about being able for us to feel what it is that, that comes up, and to have that be related to something how we respond to what it is that we see happening, so that there's a conjoining, we might say, of the water and the fire, and it's not just fire acting out of fire, and it's not water just sort of becoming like a puddle and inert and in and of itself. There's something about the union, the dance, the cooking of both the feeling and then the ideation and the action that can come out of that. And I think it's so easy for us to be cut off from the feeling level for many reasons, especially given our more greater orientation toward thinking and arguing and that more intellection. So yeah, I guess in this moment, in relationship to what I've shared this morning, like that's what comes to mind. Like, how do we hold, what does our bain-marie look like? Like what is that for each of us? How do we hold the water and the fire together in a in a purposeful and responsible way? We're not setting fire to the kitchen. We're not flooding it with too much water. There are all these different ways that we can, I think that alchemical images help us notice what's going on for us and how we're underdoing or overdoing a certain kind of elemental way of being. Yeah.
Thank you, Safron. That was very, very helpful.
Does that feel, does that feel sort of, yeah, I mean, how does that sit for you as you think the way you are working this
Well, to
moment?
me, it's I was frantically trying to write down everything you were saying, but it really resonates for me that in a purposeful and responsible way, bringing those together, you said, and also this whole feeling, ideation, and then action, right? Which is really one of those the elements that we're really in need of. Any other questions? Just we have about 5 more minutes. Any reflections? I invite our participants. You can also, oh, there we go, Peter.
Seeing no other hands, just in hearing the two of you talk, I reflect back on this idea of the embodied anger versus the celestial anger. And I just get curious about your two's reflections on the way feeling and thinking can come together to digest the anger, to enable some type of inspiration, some type of celestial visitation, some image of our shared future. And I just wonder what you think. Well, actually, I don't. I wonder what you think, feel.
Well, I think digestion is hugely important, and digestion would belong to the realm of alchemical fire because it's about metabolic heat, isn't it? Metabolic heat, right? The heat of the body transforming things, and that is that, and so what needs to be, how do we digest the anger and in order to then act in strong, clear, vivifying ways? That all feels very fiery, but the digestion itself would also mean slowness and time and patience. See that, so because the body then brings in the earth element, and so like how do we really, as you know, as we all are in our different ways attuned to the you know, the emotional depths, it's hard holding the emotions that erupt. And so how does the earth element, learning how to really endure what it is that emerges out of, let's say, one of these terrestrial volcanic explosions of emotion, and how do we hold that long enough for that to be metabolized and then become something of a this and not that, and you know. And that's why moving into the astrological imagination, like working with our Mars is so important because Mars, you know, is that active agent. And if we don't have a relationship to our Mars and the different faces of our Mars, the vessel can be burst too quickly, or we're too fearful of moving out of the vessel. Mars is a really significant part, I think, of a lot of what we're actually talking about in you know, in this astrological imagery.
Thank you, Safron. And since Peter generously shared his question with me as well, I just will say in a nutshell very quickly, I was sharing with Dr. Rossi before her presentation, my current work is so much focused on arts and activism. So when I hear that question, first thing that comes up for me is the arts as container, where some of that digestion can happen, where some of that the feeling and thinking can come together and cook together, whether it's through music, literature, poetry, you know, street art, graffiti. So that's where I'm at. And I see that as a potential vessel for both collective as well as individual. There was one more hand, I missed it. Cindy, do you still want to join?
I'll try to make it quick. I was afraid the time was running out. Thank you, Safron. It was beautiful. beautiful. And I was curious, I was sort of thinking while you were talking, and, you know, with the concept of the sister arts of astrology and alchemy. And we know that Jung studied astrology and all of the things, and this is, you know, too complex to kind of put into one answer, but why he chose alchemy as his main metaphor.
Yeah.
Rather than astrology. And there's maybe the obvious, you know, the language of astrology is so separate and complex. But since you work with both, do you find both are necessary when you're doing a reading, that the alchemical language
Yeah.
helps with someone to
Yeah.
symbolize?
Absolutely, because whether I'm working with someone who is an astrologer or isn't, and they're just coming to work with me, the astrological phrases aren't embodied, and so when we start talking about digestion and watery places and fiery places, regardless of whether one has familiarity of the language or not, they can feel into, and I can more richly try to communicate what these archetypal processes that the planets symbolize. Well, what does that actually feel like or look like? And that then someone can take in and begin to connect to their life experience in a really direct way. So that's why I think alchemy is so powerful, because there's a image-rich, sensate, embodied sort of palette or pantheon, if you will, that people get. Like, we get it, you know, what it is to feel melty and loose and warm versus constricted and buried in the ground. And, you know, I mean, it just moves in a different way. I think it just opens things up in a different way. Now, and for me, it's wedded through my way of thinking astrologically, which is thinking alchemically, and is ultimately trying to think archetypally, right? So that's really, but, you know, the last thing I might say about, I think astrology is still, and for many different reasons, sort of burdened by a lot of literalism and predictive. There's a difficult sort of ancestry that belongs to astrology, and we can't really get away from it. And my sense is that that's partially why, you know, that kind of stayed, you know, in-house for Jung rather than alchemy, which in its own way could be opened up. It just isn't burdened with the same problems, I think, culturally speaking. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On behalf of IAJS, thank you so much, Safron, for sharing your wisdom, your presence, and everyone who joined us today. Thank you for your participation, your questions, reflections. I find these conversations to be so important for our field, keeping Jungian psychology vibrant and vital, bridging scholarship and soul and theory and intuition, imagination, intellect. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks again,
Thank
Seth.
you. Bye. Good to see you.
Bye, Carrie.